Hi, I'm David Freudberg. Each week at the Humankind on Public Radio podcast, we strive to practice the simple art of listening. At times it can feel like a lost art in our noisy world, and of course not everything is worth listening to. But for me, when I'm able to get centered, listening can be almost a sacred experience, a moment of focused attention that accords the speaker a measure of dignity. If you value this too, please help others to find our podcast. Consider going to Humankind on Public Radio at iTunes and leave us a kind review. And thanks for listening. This week and next, our Humankind on Public Radio podcast examines the story of Ted Kaczynski, who came to be known as the Unabomber. He was found dead in his prison cell on June 10, 2023, at age 81. In our coverage about this topic, I've always felt the main story was not the criminal spree by Ted, but the courage shown by his brother David Kaczynski, who came to the horrifying realization that his mentally ill brother had committed these crimes. And you'll hear about his dark night of the soul. Stay tuned. Humankind is produced in association with WGBH Boston and supported by the Humankind Program Fund. Additional funding for this series has been provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the National Institutes of Health, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and the Park Foundation.
I remember finally meeting with the FBI, and after a couple of days of interviews, they had showed me a map of rural Montana and asked me to point out the place on that map where my brother lived. And I remember, sort of walking to that map and kind of gingerly putting my finger down and feeling just how painful that was for me.
The story of David Kaczynski, who felt compelled to turn in his brother, the Unabomber, and who now works for justice. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. It was a manhunt that started in 1978 when a package containing a bomb was found at a university parking lot in Chicago. The mysterious sender, who became known as the Unabomber, would strike 15 more times over a span of nearly 18 years. His explosives were placed at universities, on an airplane, at private homes. They would leave 3 dead and 16 injured in a bizarre protest against people involved in the spread of technology. Finally arrested in 1996, the Unabomber turned out to be 53-year-old Ted Kaczynski, a brilliant mathematician and troubled loner.
Since he quit his job at University of California at Berkeley, in the late 1960s, he had been living in an isolated cabin along the Continental Divide in Montana.
The Unabomber's brother, David Kaczynski.
At one point, he'd written to me with some pride that he had lived for a whole year, kept his accounts, and managed to survive on just 12 cents a day. He had no running water, no electricity, obviously no telephone. Most of our communication was through the mail.
This is the remarkable story of how David Kaczynski, a thoughtful and sensitive social worker, came to realize his eccentric brother was a serial murderer, how David made the anguished decision to turn his brother in, quite possibly leading to a death sentence, and why he now works to abolish the death penalty and improve our system of justice.
This cold-blooded murder is the latest deadly development in a series of bombings codenamed Unabomber. The United States Attorney's Office, together with all of law enforcement, is committed to apprehending and bringing this criminal to justice.
December 1994. Faith Hochberg, a U.S. attorney in New Jersey, following the murder by package bomb of an advertising executive whose firm did PR work related to an Exxon oil spill. It was the second time the Unabomber had killed. During the 90s, David Kaczynski received correspondence from his brother in Montana that seemed increasingly extreme, fanatical, and bizarre.
My wife Linda had said to me, "David, I think your brother's sick." You know, I guess I didn't have her objectivity. My first reaction was, well, you know, this is the way Ted is. This is the way he thinks. And she said, "David, read this letter. You know, people who are healthy do not think this way." And it was at that point that we took some of his letters to a psychiatrist and began to explore whether there was anything we could do to try to find out what was wrong, find out if we could help him intervene for his benefit in some way.
Although Ted Kaczynski had largely cut himself off from his family, David still nurtured an affection for the clever older brother he had looked up to as a kid in Chicago.
You know, there was 7.5 years difference between us, but kind of as I was moving into adolescence and Ted into young adulthood, I think there was quite a bond. We both loved the out of doors. I felt it was kind of almost a privilege to share some of that with him because he was older and more mature and more intelligent. I've often felt that on some deep level there is a part of Ted in me. I hope it's the good part.
He was very quiet. He was well-spoken. He's the only one that's ever missed me at the library. He read stuff that I certainly couldn't read because he wanted it in the original languages. And he was, I don't know, quiet, nice man.
Bev Coleman, a librarian in Lincoln, Montana, near the 10 feet by 12 feet cabin where Ted Kaczynski lived a solitary life in nature, read widely, wrote his angry statements about the harmful consequences of technology, and where he manufactured bombs. One of the victims was Gary Wright, co-owner of a computer store in Salt Lake City, Utah, who was injured by the Unabomber in 1987.
I had been out working early in the morning, and I was returning back to my office building about 10:30 that morning. And as I drove into the parking lot, I noticed what looked to appear to be just some scrap wood from a construction project. So it kind of looked somewhat like two 2x4s that were nailed together with nails sticking out of it. So as I drove into the parking lot, I thought, well, I'd better just go move that. I exited the car, and as I went over to pick this up, it's something just really wrong happened within just a short time. And I don't actually remember the device going off, but within a very short time, I was about 20 feet from where the device was, and I was just standing there. Things went into slow motion. I mean, you see it on television a lot, and it's not quite accurate the way that it looks on television. But I watched the wires from the telephone and the electrical into the building. They were moving in slow motion in kind of a sine wave pattern, and there was debris just kind of raining down and spiraling like confetti, if you will. And the first thought was that I'd been shot. I really thought that someone had come around the corner and shot me with a shotgun or something. I don't know why that was the first thought, but it was. And, my mind started to race a little bit about, I may not make it. I might not live through this. I mean, they were just real clear thoughts. I looked down and noticed the bottom half of my pants was gone, and I had on a white dress shirt that day, and the blood started to come through the shirt, and I could see at the time they looked like needles that were threaded through the cloth, if you will, and what they turned out to be was the wood, as it exploded, turned into like millions of little needles, and so it fractured and just came out like that, and a lot of the wood impaled itself under my neck, so I was kind of like a porcupine. Just had this wood sticking out. But my thoughts were so clear, and I walked into they walked me into my office. My family worked for me at the time, and
So you were in the midst of this. You were able to walk.
yes, it was strange. I was just standing up. I guess the impact as it knocked me back, I must have flown through the air and landed on my feet, because I didn't really hit the ground, and I was just kind of bouncing around as if I were on a pogo stick. I remember that distinctly. It was kind of, I guess, the shock, but I was just jumping kind of.
And you're saying that you had no recollection of the actual moment of explosion.
Right.
You don't remember hearing a loud noise or...
No, I remember, the thing I remember is that I went to pick it up, and I moved it, but then it sounded like the scream of a fighter jet when it goes over, like an F-16, just a real shrill sound. And then from that point, I had a harder time hearing. It was almost like being under the water in a swimming pool or something. I could hear, but not real clearly. And there was a lot of commotion going on. Obviously, people running out of buildings and things like that. But one real distinct thought that has always stuck with me. I was in the middle of this commotion, if you will, and I couldn't hear. But inside my head, this just huge voice says, "You'll be okay," and it was phenomenal. I mean, it just forever will stay with me.
So you underwent some medical care at that point?
I did. They took about 200 pieces of shrapnel out of lower part of my body, some in the upper. It severed the ulnar nerve in my left arm. They did some pretty good reconstruction on my face, where there was a nail that went through my chin, through my lips, and really the only thing that saved my eyesight was it was a strange day in February in Utah. It was a warm, sunny day, and you don't just have them that often. And I was wearing some sunglasses, some Varney sunglasses, and it deflected all of those pieces of shrapnel, or they did. When I looked at them later, they kind of looked like welding goggles, if you will, that had been used for a lot of years. So we're real fortunate in that regard. So
you had no prior connection whatsoever with Ted?
No, none at all. And I was actually surprised as it moved forward that, I thought I was a fairly well-informed person, read a lot of newspaper, watched a lot of news, that sort of thing, and I'd never heard of the Unabomber. So it did surprise me.
Quite a surprise.
Yeah.
Another of the Unabomber's victims was a Yale University computer specialist who lost sight in one eye, hearing in one ear, and part of his hand from the explosion. The Unabomber later sent him a bitter letter, read here by FBI agent Jim Freeman.
People with advanced degrees aren't as smart as they think they are. If you'd had any brains, you would have realized that there are a lot of people out there who resent bitterly the way techno-nerds like you are changing the world, and you wouldn't have been dumb enough to open an unexpected package from an unknown source.
Baffled authorities hoped that the Unabomber's writings would offer a clue to his identity, and the Justice Department recommended publication of a long, rambling manifesto against technology that Ted Kaczynski mailed to the New York Times in 1995. The hope was that someone would recognize in the manifesto a link to its author. 5 months later, in an arrangement with the Times, the manifesto appeared in the Washington Post in an 8-page supplement. By then, David Kaczynski, living in Schenectady, New York, had been forming suspicions about his brother in Montana.
It actually began again with my wife, Linda. She sat me down one day and said, "Dave, don't get angry at me, but I'm kind of burdened with this. Did it ever occur to you as even a remote possibility that your brother Ted might be the Unabomber?"
So that was before the publication in the Post?
Yes, I think it was about the time there was a flurry of newspaper articles to the effect that the Unabomber had sent his manifesto to the newspapers, and the newspapers were kind of debating about whether it should be published or not. And it had also been revealed that they thought the Unabomber had come from Chicago, since that was where the first bombs had gone off, and also that he had some connection with the University of California at Berkeley, since 2 devices had gone off there. And Linda thought, well, gee, we've got Chicago, Berkeley, and now some kind of anti-technology manifesto. And she knew through me that my brother had a kind of a long-standing preoccupation with problems associated with technology. At that point, I was really dismissive. I just said, you don't know him. I know him. He's not capable of this. But I promised to read the manifesto if it were ever published. And, I read that manifesto, and I was really all set to find something in there that disqualified it as Ted's writing, and unfortunately I couldn't find anything like that. I still was not, I still thought it was only a slim chance that he'd written it. I think I told Linda at that time, well, maybe there's one chance in 1,000. And in fact, I went to the library, read everything I could, hoping to find something that would disqualify Ted. And I looked at the sketch, and it didn't particularly look like Ted. The description was of someone 3 inches taller, 10 years younger, different hair color. And I was sort of feeling, this was good. It wasn't a match. On the other hand, I learned at that point that there was an association with Salt Lake City, and I had known that Ted had spent a summer working there. So that was another piece of the puzzle, the realization that I could connect him with each of the 3 places. Linda and I spent about the next 3 weeks combing through the manifesto, bunches of my brother's old letters, and it seemed like through that process, not that I found the proverbial smoking gun or anything, but it was almost as if I could sort of hear my brother's voice there. I remember waking up on a particular morning and just feeling a kind of crushing sense of depression. My first thought was, gee, that's the worst nightmare I've ever had. But then as the cobwebs melted away a little bit, I realized it wasn't a nightmare. I was literally considering the possibility that my own brother might be a serial bomber, killer of 3 people, most wanted man in America. I walked to the breakfast table where Linda was already seated, eating some cornflakes, looked up at her and said, hon, I think there might be a 50-50 chance that Ted wrote this. And, she had been kind of forced to look at this through my eyes since she didn't know him, I did. And here I am saying, this is a real credible possibility.
Until he was finally apprehended, the Unabomber was mysterious. His unknown identity was frustrating to law enforcement officials and deeply disturbing to the bomber's victims, who simply couldn't understand why they had been targeted for savage violence.
I didn't know who it was for 9 years.
Gary Wright.
And there was a 7-year blank period where nothing happened. And that was probably attributed to the sketch that my secretary did when it was the first identification, if you will, the hooded drawing of the Unabomber. And that piece is a lot more complicated, a lot more time with the emotional collapse and things like that go on, where you just don't know exactly what you're going to do. You wonder constantly, why would anybody want to kill you, and who could it be, and those sorts of things, and where does it go appropriately, and how do you deal with it?
Did you have a dark night of the soul in wrestling with those divided loyalties? On the one hand, your brother who you loved, on the other hand, realizing that there was a serial killer at large?
Yeah, I remember that same evening that I had told Linda that I thought there was a 50-50 chance. We were just consumed with it, talking about it. Is he or isn't he? What does this do? What does this ask us to do? I remember talking about it on into the night as we're both kind of lying there sleeplessly, and I'm trying to put together my brother, as I remember him, with a person who might be capable of such horrible crimes. And instead I'm having memories that have a sort of the opposite tone. I'm remembering things from many years back, fond memories, camping trips, playing softball on an informal team one year, together. I told Linda this one story that really had an effect on her. When I was 2.5, our family had moved from the back of the yards neighborhood of Chicago out to the suburbs, and it was our first house. It was my first backyard as a little boy. And I can recall that during that first summer, I'd push my way out through the screen door, play around in the backyard. The trouble, though, was getting inside the house, because at 2.5 I was so short I couldn't reach the doorknob. But one day Ted had showed up, and always a very ingenious person. He'd taken a little spool of thread from my mom's sewing kit, a hammer, and a nail from my dad's toolkit, and he nailed the spool of thread onto the wooden screen door so that it made a makeshift door handle. So I'm remembering this 42 years later, wondering if my brother's the Unabomber, and I hear a little sound, and it's coming from Lyndon. The room is dim, but there's like a little light shining through the shade, and I look and I see her face is just flowing with tears. It was a very important moment for me, because I think it might have been the first moment that Linda really saw the full human dimensions of this tragedy. In fact, the first moment that she saw Ted as a human being. Up until then, he had been, the weird brother-in-law, the mentally ill guy, the hermit in Montana, now perhaps even the Unabomber. But on hearing the story, I think she understood what a deep bond I had with Ted, that this was really tearing me apart. And I suppose as well that, no matter how twisted Ted may have become, that nice little 10-year-old boy was part of who he was. It was part of his history. It would always be there, and this was just an enormous tragedy for our family.
So how do you make a decision to proceed in the direction of notifying the authorities?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to note that this was a couple's decision. I think usually you think of there's got to be one heroic consciousness here that makes a decision. I think from that moment on, we were really together in this. Linda had been a philosophy professor at a small college in upstate New York for 18 years. Among the courses she taught were ethics, always a very principled person. I, at this point, was working in a youth shelter for runaway and homeless kids, Always I advise kids, even if you don't fully trust the school principal or the police, you've got to find some adult that you do trust if it's a matter of somebody's health and safety. You've got to do the right thing. You won't regret it. Well, it's easy to say that when it's someone else you're giving the advice to. Here I was confronted with a situation where this was truly what defined me, or these were just words I had said to make myself feel good. I think there was still a lot that had to be wrestled with, but I guess there was a clear sense that we couldn't just sit by and hope for the best or say that it wasn't our job. No one should expect a family member to turn in a family member. That at least if we took some action, we weren't helpless. We could do something to stop the violence. And then perhaps if we communicated to the authorities that Ted was mentally ill, that could save his life. But I guess we had to take on that first responsibility first.
Were you able to come to a place where you felt at peace with such a painful decision?
At the time, and for really a couple of years, I was deeply conflicted about it. This was my brother. Brothers are supposed to protect brothers. I loved Ted. I know that he had loved me. I found myself in a situation where anything I did could lead to somebody's death. What would it be like to wake up one day and realize somebody else had been killed and that we had been in a position to prevent that and failed to do anything? We'd have their blood on our hands. How do you live with that for the rest of your life? On the other hand, how do you live with turning in a brother who ends up being executed? How do you face your mother, elderly woman who's worried for years about her son because of his estrangement from the family because of his emotional problems, and see in her eyes that, she knows that he's being executed because you turned him in. Those weren't pleasant thoughts.
How did your mother walk through all this?
I think we had wanted to spare her for as long as possible. Again, even when we approached the FBI, we didn't feel certain that Ted was responsible. We hoped that they would find some way to rule him out as a suspect. Eventually, I got the call I'd been dreading. An agent that we'd been working closely with said, David, we've done everything possible to rule out your brother as a suspect. Unfortunately, he's moved to the top of our suspect list, and we're now at a point in the investigation where we need to speak with your mom. Do you think you could arrange an interview for us? So I remember going to her apartment. It was on a Saturday morning. She opened the door, and I saw her face change. So obviously my anguish must have been written all over me. And she said, David, something's wrong. You've got to tell me. What is it? And I said, yeah, Mom, I think you better sit down. Her first reaction was a mother's reaction, perhaps a mother's intuition, is, it's Ted. Is it something about Ted? And I said, well, Mom, as far as I know, he's in good health, but I do have something very troubling to tell you. She sat down in this little lazy boy chair where I always picture her reading or watching television. I was much too agitated to sit down. I was kind of pacing the room back and forth, trying to find some way to deliver this news painlessly, but there was no way to do that. Before long, I'm crying a little bit. Mom's just sitting in that chair, not saying a word, looking at me with this fixed look of horror on her face. And, I'm realizing not many relationships are tested in quite this cruel way. How could I be certain she'd even love me after I told her what I'd done? I kind of got to the end of what I had to say and said, Mom, I think there's a chance Ted might be involved. Mom, I've even taken the step of calling the FBI, and they're currently investigating him. And I'll always remember what Mom did next. It was just extraordinary, a real extraordinary gesture. She got up out of her chair, and she's a very small woman. I'm a little over 6 feet tall. She's a little under 5 feet tall. And she walked up to me, reached up her arms around my neck, and put a kiss on my cheek. And the first thing she said was, David, I can't imagine what you've been going through. Extraordinary to me that in this most terrible moment, her first concern was for my feelings. And then she said probably the most comforting things I could have heard. She said, David, I know that you love Ted. I know that you wouldn't have done this unless you felt like you had to. So in some ways, she's truly a kind of hero of this story. Probably at that moment, half the weight of the world came off my shoulders. I realized I hadn't lost my mother's love, and that she, Linda, and I were now in this together. And, after telling me what she said, she said, well, David, I just can't imagine. Ted loves animals. He's never been violent. I just don't think he's capable of doing these sorts of things. Maybe it's a good thing that you've contacted the authorities. They're going to investigate. They're going to find out he's innocent, and all of this will go away like a bad dream. And I think she felt that very strongly at the outset.
But the Kaczynski family's ordeal would not turn out to have been an illusion. David's courageous decision to tell the authorities that he suspected his brother Ted was the Unabomber would end the bombing spree of almost 18 years. And with his brother behind bars, David would embark on a campaign to abolish the death penalty. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. Studio recording by Bill Wangren and Alan Mattis. Editorial assistance from Thomas Royal. Our program is presented by Human Media in association with The Network Incorporated. Program development and support provided by Shart Media.
You can hear more episodes of our series at humankindpodcast.org. That's humankindpodcast.org.
This segment, The Unabomber's Brother, Part 1, is Humankind Program number 82.
The executive producer is David Freudberg. Please subscribe to our free weekly podcast. The title is Humankind on Public Radio. You can find it at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all major podcast services, as well as through our website. Again, the podcast title is Humankind on Public Radio. And if you'd like to support our program, please visit humankindpodcast.org, and at the top, click on How You Can Help. Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Freudberg. We here at Humankind are trying to strike a balance to make our public radio programs available to you and also to make sure we're able to pay our production costs, from office rent to staff time to studio and distribution expenses. The grants we receive from funders you hear named on our programs don't fully cover our operating costs. And if you like what you hear, we're asking for your help so we can keep our program and this podcast going. Please visit humanmedia.org, and at the top of our homepage, click on How You Can Help. Thanks. This week and next, our Humankind on Public Radio podcast examines the story of Ted Kaczynski, who came to be known as the Unabomber. He was found dead in his prison cell on June 10, 2023, at age 81. In our coverage about this topic, I've always felt the main story was not the criminal spree by Ted, but the courage shown by his brother David Kaczynski, who came to the horrifying realization that his mentally ill brother had committed these crimes. And you'll hear about his dark night of the soul. Stay tuned. Humankind is produced in association with WGBH Boston and supported by the Humankind Program Fund. Additional funding for this series has been provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the National Institutes of Health, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and the Park Foundation.
I don't know what happened to him. I mean, I could read the diagnoses. I can have them carefully explained to me. It doesn't exhaust the question that we always ask, why?
David Kaczynski, who turned in his brother the Unabomber, reflects on justice, vengeance, and compassion. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. With growing suspicions in 1995 that his loner brother Ted was a serial killer, David Kaczynski had to make his way through a nightmarish thicket of ethical choices. To turn his brother in could mean stopping an 18-year spree of murders and maimings perpetrated by an elusive figure who came to be known as the Unabomber. But it could also mean sending his only brother to a death sentence, a form of punishment David morally abhorred. In the end, David Kaczynski felt he had no choice but to notify law enforcement. United States Attorney General Janet Reno, April 4, 1996.
On Wednesday, agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the Postal Inspection Service began executing a search warrant at the residence of Theodore John Kaczynski near Lincoln, Montana.
When he was taken into custody by federal agents from his one-room cabin, Ted Kaczynski had the appearance of an unkempt, bearded hermit. Photos of the arrest were shocking to David Kaczynski and his wife Linda Patrick, whom Ted had mostly cut off years earlier. It was a far cry from the one-time image of Ted as a promising mathematician at the University of California. Over the years, he would quit his teaching job and become a recluse, obsessed with the repercussions of technology on society. His long-winded manifesto was published by newspapers in 1995 in an attempt to catch the Unabomber. David Kaczynski.
When he was arrested, they found, in addition to a carbon copy of the manifesto and other incriminating evidence, they found a live bomb in his bed, apparently waiting to be mailed to somebody. So there was no question that he was responsible and that he probably would have struck again. I just look back and thank God that Linda and I had the insight and the courage to do what we did, and that we were able to stop it.
In June 1996, a federal grand jury in Sacramento, California, returned a 10-count indictment charging Theodore Kaczynski with 4 separate bombings. The lead prosecutor, Robert Cleary, would later publicly honor the role played by Ted Kaczynski's brother.
Everyone involved in this case is also eternally indebted to the heroic actions of David Kaczynski. He is a true American hero.
David Kaczynski's bold decision to contact federal agents about his mentally ill brother was just the beginning of an improbable odyssey exploring what justice really means. He would have a series of powerful encounters with survivors of the Unabomber's violence. David would become close friends with one of the victims. He would take on the system of capital punishment, a penalty his brother was spared, but which David regards as unjustly applied and barbaric. And through it all, David Kaczynski would be forced to keep reaching inside, to keep searching for compassion.
I get a call from someone who identified herself as a law enforcement chaplain, and she said that there was a victim's family that had requested a meeting with Mom and I and wondered if we'd be open to that. And I asked Mom, and she said, well, I think we should go. So we were taken to a room in the courthouse and faced, as we walked in the room, 3 women there. One was the widow of somebody my brother had killed. One was her sister, and the third was her husband's sister. And, you walk in and, we kind of said, we're sorry. We began to cry. And always the realization that no matter how much you say you're sorry or how sincerely, it can't undo the harm that was done. The widow spoke for the family and said that they'd wanted to take this opportunity to thank us, that it must have been very difficult what we'd done. She also said that she wanted us to know that all they had ever really wanted was for the violence to stop. I think they were telling us that they hadn't needed the death penalty for their sense of justice or closure. And that was very, very meaningful to us. There were some hugs. There were... on the other hand, here is Mom. She's facing 3 women whose lives have been just shattered by her son. And I think she had a deep, deep need to communicate to them that her son was not a monster, but a very, very sick person. And she began talking to them about schizophrenia and trying to make them understand. But it's not with our brains that we understand such things. And I don't think they were ready yet for what Mom was trying to tell them. She was seated in a chair, and I was actually standing behind her with my hands on the back of the chair. And as I looked over her head, I saw that the faces of the women didn't look pleased. Like maybe they thought Mom was making excuses for Ted. And in fact, the widow said suddenly he knew what he was doing. And it was a very intense moment. I mean, the room was suddenly kind of frozen in silence, and what had been, a humanitarian meeting with the very best of intentions, I think, looked like it was blocked. We'd come But there was this gulf of pain and loss separating us. We could sort of see on the other side, but there was no bridge to the other side. And Mom, at that moment, kind of instinctively dropped her head, and she said, I think with utmost honesty, she said, I wish he had killed me instead of your husband. And I think, all she had wanted to do really was to be a mother, to nurture her children so that they would be happy, maybe so they'd leave the world a better place for having been there. And here, at least with her eldest son, it had turned into a disaster. I don't think she had anything to live for in her own mind at that moment. But as I'm looking over her head, I'm looking at the widow and seeing that she's just stricken by what my mom had said. And in fact, she got out of her chair and knelt down beside my mom's chair, put her hand on my mom's shoulder, touched her lightly, and said, "Oh, Mrs. Kaczynski, don't do this to yourself. You're not responsible. Don't ever think that you're responsible."
That must have been amazing for your mother to hear.
Oh, yes. Unbelievably so. And I think, I think that experience was so powerful for me. I remember leaving the room that day, probably a very different person, thinking about the dignity that was present there, the honesty, the good intention out of empathy to acknowledge another person's loss. And I really felt what a fine thing the human heart is, the human soul is, that there is a core of decency that really redeems us. I mean, it's really the only thing we have to cling to when the worst happens, and it was so much in evidence in that room that evening. It made me proud to be human.
In a world that at times seems overloaded with hatred and revenge, the human capacity for compassion is a mystery. It makes you wonder why, in some instances, our empathy shuts down, while at other times we are able to stay open. Gary Wright from Salt Lake City has confronted these questions since 1987, when he was severely injured by one of the Unabomber's explosives. It would be more than 9 years before federal agents would accuse Ted Kaczynski of the crime.
After I knew who it was, I saw there was a family over there. I mean, the only instances that I had ever seen of Dave or his mom or anyone was just some brief television clips, and the way that Dave approached it and handled things, the way the whole family did, was so admirable. I mean, there was always this real almost a reverence towards a victim, and they acknowledged that every single time that I ever saw anything on the news. And I thought, that's a family going through a lot, and there's still a lot placed on the thoughts of the folks who have been hurt and have lost someone, even before their own. And that's when I started to make this connection that there's really not a lot of difference between those families. I mean, in some regards, I think it's worse on the other side because the physical pieces, they go away. I mean, you learn to do things a little different or whatever. But when you have to talk about, my brother murdered someone or think in the terms of that, that's very difficult. And I wouldn't want that burden either. But I watched the way that the Kaczynski family handled that and that Linda handled that with them. And it was amazing to me. I mean, I really felt a lot of compassion for them.
Meanwhile, David Kaczynski was continuing on his journey of trying to face the horrific consequences of the Unabomber's 18-year rampage. Although David was entirely uninvolved in his brother's brutal acts, circumstances drew him directly into the aftermath. David's warm encounter with Gary Wright is an unlikely byproduct of two people trying to do what they believe is the moral thing under very challenging conditions.
It was almost a coincidence or a lucky thing that I got to speak to Gary because we'd asked a friend to do some research and find addresses for the victims so that we could write to them and apologize. And we didn't have Gary's address at that point and ended up only getting his phone number. And I remember sort of thinking, well, maybe I should give this guy a call. And then thinking in the next second, no, maybe I better not. It could have gone either way. I just feel very fortunate that it was Gary. And, I took a big gulp and dialed his phone number and tried to think of what I was going to say. And
what did you say? How do you open a conversation like that?
Well, the phone picked up on the other side and it said, "You have reached the right house at the wrong time." It was an answering machine. And I wasn't prepared for that. But I explained who I was and said that I would like to call if he'd be open to that. And I said I'd call back later. And so Gary was a little prepared. It didn't strike him completely out of the blue. And, it's just amazing. I was sort of braced perhaps for a blast of anger, and instead I got just real warmth. He said that, he understood that my brother was ill. He really thought it took a lot of courage and guts to do what we had done. He appreciated it. Said I should never blame myself for what my brother has done, and I shouldn't blame myself if the worst happens, and from our point of view, and Ted gets executed. And he said, if you ever want to talk about this, I've been dealing with the trauma of this for a number of years, just give me a call. So as this very public process was playing out, I had this kind of resource, this person I could talk to on the other side to kind of say, "You're a good guy, Dave, and I feel for you." And I can't tell you how much that meant to me and to Linda and to Mom.
What was your first thought upon hearing the voicemail message from Ted Kaczynski's brother?
Your first instinct is, well, this is going to be interesting. That's about the best way I could describe it, not being judgmental in any way, just, this is going to be interesting. When the call first came through, though, Dave's got this real eloquent, soft-spoken manner about him, and I could just feel that. There was no, I didn't feel anything other than compassion, really, for what he was going through as well, and I thought it was really admirable and honorable that he would call to express, his thoughts from his family to me and mine, and I know that doesn't happen all the time. So I kind of viewed that as a rare moment.
David Kaczynski.
Here was a guy just about killed, and then deals for years of uncertainty and worry and wondering if the killer's going to come back. And finally, 9 or 10 years later, he gets a call from the brother of the person who did this. And, he takes the call and is almost takes me under his wing and says, "David, this is just beginning for you. I've been dealing with this for 9 years. It can get better."
So what was it like for you to have someone in that very delicate position embrace you so warmly?
Yeah. I remember following my brother's arrest. There was a period of time where, particularly when the government was signaling its intention to seek the death penalty, that I was feeling pretty miserable. I remember my wife, Linda, maybe having heard that one time too many, said, "David, there are other people in a lot of pain over this." And I remember my first reaction was to say, "No, my pain is special." I turned in my brother. It's not only pain and loss, it's guilt. And she said, "David, there are people who've lost body parts. There are people who've lost their dearest loved ones. There's a lot more pain here than just your own." I remember the day following that conversation. My wife and I are Buddhist, and part of our practice involves a morning sitting meditation. Well, the very next day, Linda had set 3 candles up on the altar in our meditation room, and I didn't have to ask what the candles were for. They represented the 3 people my brother had killed. And I think that was my first sort of awakening to the realization that there was another side to this tragedy, and that there was a kind of connection I had with those people on the other side.
Gary, how did you get to a place after this horrible thing had been visited upon you to being able to open your arms and extend a hand of compassion to someone in David's position?
Probably the biggest event that happened to me was I was driving down the road, and it was a day just kind of not unlike the day in February. And I just got this thought that was so clear, because I'd struggled with, what am I going to do with this? I don't know. I mean, I may never know who did this to me. And this thought just was so clear to me. It sounded just like a lot like the voice I'd heard earlier on, and it just said, look, if you believe in Christ and that's what your faith-based system is, and he could look down at those people and say, look, I forgive you for what you're doing to me, you don't even have a choice. And it was so powerful. I mean, I had to pull over for a minute, and I just thought about it, but it was like the whole world had lifted off of me. And you know, it wasn't until 2 years after that then Ted was caught, and I learned about it. But I think that's what prepared me for it.
It would be very understandable for somebody who underwent what you experienced to be highly motivated by vengeance, by wanting to have the person who did that to you executed. Why don't you feel that way?
Well, I try to get to myself this place I call the 50,000-foot level. And that means I can try and do my best to understand multiple points of view before I make a decision, if possible. And, you know, many times I look at the folks out there who are still angry, and I just didn't want to be a part of the anger piece of it. I had too much to lose if I was. I had my own kids. I needed to show them that, you know, you can grow beyond these bad things that happen, because it's a very long process to execute someone. The anger's there for a very long time, and that healing process, in my opinion, doesn't start until you can let go. And if you're going to begin letting go when another person is gone, that could be 13, 14 years down the road. And I really didn't feel like I could take from my family those years. I thought, I have got to get on a lot earlier than that and get moving down the road and enjoy these years. I mean, there's not that many we have. If you do believe in God, well, then turn it over to him. Let him take care of it, and you know, let it be handled in that manner. And that's kind of the tact I took, and for me, it's worked, I think, very well.
Today, Gary Wright and David Kaczynski travel the lecture circuit to urge abolition of capital punishment, which they regard as cruel and unnecessary. David serves as executive director of New Yorkers Against the Death Penalty.
I think if we think about what justice consists of, it's got to be more than retribution. And I think if there has been one very, very disturbing trend of the past 10 or 15 years, it is the equation of justice with retribution, the notion that there is no meaning to the word justice beyond imposing retribution. The harsher, the better, it seems. And you know, that's what we've got to do. We've got to take back the ideal of justice. We've got to take back this principle of human dignity. We've got to take it back from vengeance, from hatred. We've got to say, look, we're all in this together. We are human beings.
There's a line between justice and vengeance. How do you distinguish between them?
For me, gosh, I guess it comes down to saying, is there a just punishment for what happened to me? Sure.
Gary Wright.
If I was on the other side of the fence and I had lost somebody close to me and to the same person, I don't know. I'd hope I would know how I'd feel, but I honestly believe you don't know till you get there how you're going to feel. But I would hope that I could come to some reconciliation within myself to say that still has to be enough, that they're just put away, and I don't need any more than that.
I don't think vengeance has a place in a system of justice.
David Kaczynski.
I think justice for me is that which draws out our humanity and that draws out our essential human dignity. For me, there can't be justice without wisdom. For me, there can't be real wisdom without compassion. I think if you see that it's a human being there, that there is a kind of human presence there, you respond to that person in a very different way, at a deeper level. You can hold them accountable. You can grieve for their loss. You may be even impelled to help them, though they've done something terrible. To me, the notion that we're going to beat down people who are probably got in this situation because they were damaged to begin with is contrary to my understanding of justice. For me, justice is sort of born out of the heart. It's a deep human dimension. It's ultimately that which connects us all. And I think to say, well, certain people are disposable or certain people we just need to get rid of, violates that principle of justice, the inclusiveness of a community of justice and a community of conscience.
In the Unabomber case, the U.S. Justice Department sought the death penalty for Ted Kaczynski following his arrest in 1996. The government's decision deeply hurt David Kaczynski, who felt that capital punishment was inappropriate in the case of his mentally ill brother. A court-ordered psychiatric evaluation diagnosed the Unabomber as a paranoid schizophrenic. David also believed that executing Ted would serve to discourage family members in similar cases from coming forward. Then in January 1998, the trial came to a sudden end. Prosecutor Robert Cleary.
The Unabomber's career is over. Today, for the very first time, Mr. Kaczynski offered to plead to a sentence of life in prison with absolutely no strings attached.
The sentencing hearing itself, was very tough. I mean, there was folks speaking, a woman had lost her husband, and, so a lot of emotion, a lot of pain that was expressed.
Gary Wright.
It was probably one of the most poignant points in my life, really. When I spoke, I really had the chance to say what was on my mind, and I was probably the fourth speaker in line out of 6. Ted had been sitting at the table writing notes, and I gave my talk, and there came a point where I just said, Ted, I don't hate you. I forgave you. Because if I hadn't, I'd have been kindling to your cause. And something really amazing happened because the pencil dropped out of his hand, and he looked up, and we just locked eyes. And it was like all of that I had been through and thought about and had experienced was transferred. And now it just felt very freeing, and it wasn't a hateful thing. It was more like, this is what you own as a person, and that's what I'm giving to you.
Theodore Kaczynski received 4 consecutive life sentences and was remanded to a maximum security prison in Colorado. He refuses to respond to letters sent by his family members. Yet always the question lingers, the enigma of what happened inside the mind of Ted Kaczynski. His brother David.
I think it's a real tragedy that my brother, with his promise, with some of the sensitivity that I know he had, surrendered to his demons and left the world a far worse place, a poorer place for having been there. I think it was the delusions, the confusion, the fear, all of the things that come with his isolation and his mental illness that distorted his understanding of his place in the world. I think he felt ultimately very disconnected. It's really the kind of connections that heal us, that create justice, that create community. And Ted was so isolated, he lost his sense of being connected to others.
You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. Studio recording by Bill Wangren and Alan Mattis. Editorial assistance from Thomas Royal. Our program is presented by Human Media in association with The Network Incorporated. Program development and support provided by Shart Media.
You can hear more episodes of our series at humankindpodcast.org. That's humankindpodcast.org.
This segment, part 2 of our profile of the Unabomber's brother, is Humankind Program number 83.
The executive producer is David Freudberg. Please subscribe to our free weekly podcast. The title is Humankind on Public Radio. You can find it at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all major podcast services, as well as through our website. Again, the podcast title is Humankind on Public Radio. And if you'd like to support our program, please visit humankindpodcast.org, and at the top, click on How You Can Help. Thank you.